Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and just as yesterday we spent some time talking about men's issues, we rejoined that again with a different author and a different book that, again, I would highly commend to you. Next hour, we're going to spend some time talking with our friend Dr. Frank Turek. We'll get back into this issue of apologetics, even talking about the Southern Evangelical Seminary's Apologetics Conference. And before we're done, we'll probably talk with him, and I know we will after we let him go, talk about what is happening with the Disney Corporation, and that is kind of front and center. We may not get to some of the conversation today about a number of other issues, including the war in Ukraine, but don't forget that tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Dr. Merle Matthews will be with us, and Lathan Watts, and we'll get into that in more detail as well. The book that we are talking about is one that has come out. It's 200 pages. It is written by Chase Replogle, and he is an individual that is the pastor of Bent Oak Church in Springfield, Missouri. Individual holds a degree in biblical studies with a master's degree in New Testament, and also currently a D-Min student at Western Theological Seminary. It is entitled The 5 Masculine Instincts, a guide to becoming a better man. And as well, we also have information about him, his church, but also the Pastor Writer podcast, where he interviews Christian authors on writing and publishing. So, Chase, it's a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Yeah, well, I'm really grateful for the opportunity and honored to be able to talk about an important topic, one that I know you care about, obviously, as well, too. And so looking forward to it. Well,
let's see if we can talk about meat. And the reason for that is that we have encouraged some people, of course, to watch some of the video trailers, in which I remember when I watched it before I even really delved into the book, I thought, we're talking about meat, we're talking about men, where are we going with this? But you used that in the opening chapter, and I thought your conclusion was wonderful, because it's kind of like, okay, given the fact that men too tend to eat more meat than others, there's always this question that people are asking, about that. And if we can't agree on how much meat to eat, and I was just with my doctor earlier today, and he told me that I need to get more protein, which I've been working on anyway, I thought it is an illustration of the fact that as we get into these different masculine instincts tied to different individuals in the Old Testament, there's going to be some controversy, but that's what I like about you. You don't stray away from it. You actually confront it head on.
Yeah, well, I'm keenly aware putting the word masculinity in the title of a book these days is controversial, regardless what's actually in the book. So just to take up the conversation is a controversy. And you're right, men eat 57% more meat than women. There's a whole range of reasons people have speculated, from evolutionary biology to marketing ploys, whether it's, some will say we should be adopting a meat-only diet, while others will say that all of our meat consumption is risking human destruction through global warming, and we should all take up a vegan diet. And I do make the point at the beginning of the book, if there's this much controversy and debate around what you ate for lunch today, well, what else is controversial about being a man today? And the answer to that is a lot. It is a controversial conversation, unfortunately.
Let me just mention the foreword by Mark Batterson. He's been on the program with us many times as well. As you go through the various accolades that you received, Jim Daly, of course, has been on with us, Scott Sauls, as well as William Boykin and Robert Wogemuth, and a variety of other individuals that have been endorsing the book. It is published by Moody. We have information about it on the website, and so again, if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, it came out earlier this month, should be in the local bookstore, but if not, there's a place for you can get it in paperback in Kindle, and as well as giving a link to your Facebook page and Twitter posts and things of that nature. We also have a link to pastorwriter.com, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But as a pastor, I know you've addressed this issue, and it makes a great deal of sense, because I've oftentimes said that if we really want to understand some things about personality, families, and the rest, the best place to go is in the Old Testament. We know a little bit about some of the authors in the New Testament, but not a lot. But we have an incredible amount of information that is available with people like Abraham and Joseph and David and others. And so in some respects, you've tied some of these masculine instincts to 5 men in the Bible who wrestled with those instincts. And that's helpful, I would have to say, Chase, because some people say, well, when I see those people in the Old Testament, especially when they show up in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, I can't relate to those kind of people. When you begin to look at their flaws, you realize they were individuals like us dealing with the same kind of tendencies, temptations, and instincts, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I write in the book that we often think of them as heroes, and I don't think that's quite the right way to think of them. Eric Auerbach, who wrote a famous literary criticism work called Mimesis, actually highlights how the Hebrew storytellers told very different stories than, say, Homer, who really wanted to create these sort of epic characters. That the Hebrew storytellers, the Old Testament storytellers, they wanted us to be able to see ourselves in the stories. The way I describe it is they wanted the biblical characters to expose us. They really are more companions than they are heroes. And so you read their story carefully, and you find the great things that happened in their life, but you also find the really human, the sinful, the struggles. You're right, the wrestling with instincts that really does resonate so much with our own experiences.
One other comment before we get into some of the specific issues, especially some of these instincts. You do mention the fact, and of course you mentioned just in passing a minute ago, what you call the masculine malaise. And I thought that was helpful, because there is a time not so long ago, since I'm the old guy around the table, when you'd have a men's retreat and there was no hesitation about talking about being masculine and going out on a retreat and talking about being a good provider for your family and all the rest. But with the rise first of the feminist movement, then the rise of any kind of criticism of Christianity, there has been, I think, a real attack on men. And I suspect that in some respects, that's another reason why you felt this book was necessary, because not only in your church, Bent Oak Church, but in churches around the country, a lot of men just say, I don't know where I fit. Some of the things that are done in church don't really relate to what I'm doing. I know you love to go out to the outdoors and love to do some things like quail hunting and the rest, but some guys are going, everything in the church has nothing to do with any of that. And so this has become kind of a malaise, and we even talk about this idea of toxic masculinity, don't we?
Yeah, well, certainly this cultural conversation around the toxicity of masculinity has caused a lot of men to become defensive, but also to check out. There's an old Irish proverb that says, for every mile of road, there's 2 miles of ditch. And there certainly is a ditch men can fall into where you're violent, overly aggressive. There is a real kind, we want to call that toxic masculinity. That's fine. But really the challenge I see is not that. It's men overcorrecting into this other ditch where men are just becoming apathetic, disengaged, dropping out. It's true across education and the workplace. It's a true pandemic of men dropping out from the home. The fatherlessness epidemic is just at the root cause of so many of our social challenges. It's also true of men participating less in church services and also personal practices of faith. So to me, the real challenge that we're facing right now with men is the men dropping out. And that's a challenge that, unfortunately, just looking at the externals, just talking about toxicity like our culture wants to have is not really helping us address. And as a pastor myself, I've got a lot of sympathy. It's hard to get men to engage. And certainly the ways we've been going about it right now have just not proved all that effective.
Well, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to get into some of these instincts, sarcasm, adventure, ambition, reputation, apathy. And we're privileged to have with us today Chase Replogle, and we will continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we come to the end of the first quarter of 2022, I think we can say we've learned a few lessons which we should apply to the future. One lesson comes from Canada. The other lesson comes from Russia. The controversy over the truckers in Canada revealed some economic lessons to us about Western democracies that used to be disregarded as nothing more than conspiracy theories. The response from Justin Trudeau showed that even a liberal democratic government could seize the bank accounts and financial assets of ordinary citizens. Canada is the 9th largest economy in the world and one of the most advanced democracies in the world, yet it used emergency measures to freeze accounts and seize accounts without due process. The Canadian actions are why many investors are looking for censorship-resistant assets. The second lesson came from the economic response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The EU and the U.S. were able to seize Russian central bank assets. U.S. treasuries are supposed to be one of the safest assets in existence. They're supposed to be a zero-risk asset. The assumption was central banks would treat each other with sovereign immunity. Simultaneously, Visa and MasterCard stopped processing foreign purchases of millions of Russian citizens. Apple and Google shut off their smartphone-enabled payments. This unplugging of the world's 11th largest economy is a new chapter in the history of economic conflict. Our world relies on a financial system working efficiently, but these actions are unprecedented. Sanctions have been used before against smaller countries, but this is different. We may agree with these sanctions against Russia, but this illustrates a point I've made before. If these Western governments can shut off a powerful government like Russia, imagine what they can do to you. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Chase Replogle. And again, he is the author of the book, The 5 Masculine Instincts, A Guide to Becoming a Better Man. By the way, one of the endorsements comes from Gene Getz, who has been a good friend of this ministry for many years. And next week when we do our Truth Team, he actually is going to come in studio. He just had his 90th birthday and, of course, has had quite a bout with COVID, but has such nice things to say about this book by Chase. And I might just mention as well, near the back, it also has a number of other books published by Moody. Robert Wogelmuth, who was in studio with us a while back, Lies Men Believe. And, of course, a good friend that I've known for decades and decades, Bill Hendricks. Of course, I knew his father, Howard Hendricks, Men of Influence. So if you say we need to have a more dynamic ministry to men, this book, as well as some of those others that I just mentioned, I think would be really helpful to you. And this is why we want to spend some time going through this. It is a book that I certainly want to put in the hands of every man, but you women, I think as you read through this, could benefit from it as well. And quite frankly, let's be honest, you're the ones that oftentimes buy the book and hand it to them and ask them to read it. So that's why I wanted you to know about it. It came out earlier this month. And so, Chase, if we can, maybe get to the first one, and that is sarcasm. You use Cain as an example. And I work with some people that sometimes people have jokingly said they think sarcasm is their spiritual gift. So this is something that some people indeed engage in. And really, there's kind of a sarcasm that we see with Cain in his question regarding Abel. And yet use that to talk about the fact that this is one of those masculine characteristics that we've got to be careful about and really pay attention to. And I'm just delighted that you made a chapter of the book about it.
Well, thanks. It's important to point out these instincts are not masculine expectations, nor are they masculine sins. As we get into some of the others like ambition and reputation, I mean, obviously we want men to have ambition. A good reputation is something the scriptures call for. And there's certainly nothing wrong with a sarcastic joke. I took the 5 instincts that are covered in the book from Shakespeare's Stages of a Man. Shakespeare, one of the great psychological writers, is trying to get at human nature and recognizing there are these instincts that drive us as men. And the first one he describes as the reluctant schoolboy who's dragging himself to school, sort of unwilling to learn or take the lesson. If you read Cain's story, what's so interesting and what every commentator and preacher has always tried to deal with was, why does God accept Abel's sacrifice and reject Cain's sacrifice? And what struck me reading that story was Cain has an opportunity to ask God that very question. God comes down and initiates a conversation with Cain, and he warns Cain about sin crouching at your door. Its desire is to rule over you, but you must rule over it. Well, how does the immature Cain respond? He doesn't respond to God. He responds by murdering his brother. And then when God comes back and says, "Where is your brother Abel?" of course, we get the sarcastic comment, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It's easy as a reader to see in Cain's sarcasm that it's really contempt. It's an unwillingness to take anything seriously. It's an unwillingness to be challenged or disciplined by a heavenly authority. That God is actually giving him an opportunity to better understand the kind of worship, the kind of sacrifice God desires. It's really a gift that Cain is receiving, to be able to know God's heart. But he cannot be challenged. Instead, he clings to his immaturity. He uses sarcasm to cover his contempt. And he ends up, the scripture says, in the land of Nod. It's Hebrew, the land of wandering. He ends up adrift and aimless and lost, which so often is the consequence of a life that overindulges this sarcasm, this unwillingness to take anything seriously. I think we all know men, and perhaps ourselves, or at times in our life, have found this instinct at work within us too.
Well, again, sometimes the phrase, matter of fact, I have a commentary recently where one of these professors said to all these students protesting, "Grow up." And again, you talk about Cain's rite of passage. Basically, his bar mitzvah was one where he really needed to no longer just be the son of Adam and Eve, but have, in a sense, come into his own. And so you a little bit later quote from, of course, a very famous quote in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, in which it talked about men without chests. And we demand that people are responsible, and yet then we're surprised when we don't make them responsible. We don't send them through some kind of educational process. We don't maybe correct them when they've done something wrong. And then we lament that we have crime in the streets and immorality in the community simply because we have, as you said, men without chests.
Yeah, isn't it such a powerful quote? I mean, Lewis was so ahead of his time in seeing where education was going. The Abolition of Man is really a critique of the approach to education that we've seen played out in our own time. And I love that line where he says, "We laugh at honor, and yet we're shocked to find traitors in our midst." Yes. I think it describes so well the moment we find ourselves in. We refuse to acknowledge any moral law, any natural law of right or wrong. We refuse to teach children this idea of what they should believe is true, what is right, what is good. And so then we're shocked when we find a generation of men that won't grow up, that end up aimless and wandering, that can't rise to the occasion to bear responsibility in families or within society or within the church. And so many, what I think we've done is we've really robbed men of what ancient generations of men had, which was a path by which they understand who they are, understand the challenges of their own human nature, and mature those instincts into something better, into something that can be useful and can bear responsibility. And so many men just don't know how to move forward. They don't know how to do that.
You know, again, you had in the secular world the men's movement, and even had people going out there and getting back to tribal things. Of course, in the Christian world, you've had, of course, Promise Keepers and a number of others. But there's been a real need to actually help young boys and young men become men, and that is certainly one of the great challenges. But just before we move on, I think as we move through this, Chase, one of the things we should do is, okay, we've identified the problem. What are the solutions? And I think you identify a couple. One is humility, and the other is meekness. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, for each of the instincts, I try to pair them with an intentional spiritual practice that, again, nobody's saying you can't be sarcastic, but you need some sort of check on your life to make sure you're not overindulging this instinct, or that sarcasm might not be something more of contempt than actual joke. And so for Cain, I suggest humility, which I like to define as self-suspicion. Can I be self-suspicious about my first instinct, my first emotion or opinion, which really cracks the door open to saying to God, is it possible that you're doing something, that you're trying to teach me something, that I might be wrong in this moment? That's the very thing Cain couldn't do. But humility is sometimes a hard one to practice. We sort of have this idea of, well, I guess if I don't brag or boast, then if I'm not prideful, then maybe I just sort of get humility thrown in as well, too. So the intentional practice I put with it as well is meekness, which is not something we think of as particularly a masculine characteristic, but I think in many ways it is the missing masculine virtue, meekness. The ancient writers often spoke more highly of meekness than we do. Some of the Greek philosophers wrote of meekness in describing war horses or horses trained for battle as meek. And what they were trying to capture was not that the horse had been weakened in some way or had been broken. What they were describing was a horse that retained all of its power, its strength, its wildness, but because of training had now been able to bring that strength under the command of its rider. That's a good way of thinking of meekness. I can absorb a blow. I can be criticized and attacked, maybe even unfairly. And unlike Cain, I don't respond impulsively or reactionarily, but instead I'm able to stop for a moment, entertain, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's a lesson, and actually turn to an authority above me, a rider, a divine authority, a heavenly Father, and better understand how it is I'm supposed to grow in this moment, but also respond in that moment. That it actually is a kind of strength to be able to have that discipline in your life.
I've sometimes referred to meekness as strength under control, because you can see this with an individual that maybe is very good at martial arts, and someone taunts them and maybe even shoves them around a little bit, and they know that they could lay them out on the floor within seconds, but they still have a sense of control. Or another example is I used to speak on college campuses, and now I do radio, don't do that as much, but there would be times when 18-year-old freshmen would think they would try to make fun of one of the things I had to say or one of my arguments, and I knew verbally I have the ability to run rings around them, embarrass them, but that's not something that as a Christian we should do. And so that's a principle there that I think we need to apply, because sometimes to the world it looks like weakness, but really meekness is strength and under control. But let's take a break and we will work. Go ahead. No, good.
Well, I was going to say it's particularly relevant to this moment, but I use the boxer analogy of saying we sometimes measure a boxer's strength not just by the punch, but also by the blow that he can absorb. And so I think a man of real character and real strength isn't always just throwing a punch back, but sometimes can absorb things without the need to respond. That's certainly what Cain was unable to do.
Very good. Let's take a break, and we have a lot more to cover, and we'll get through the other 4 masculine instincts. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about what Chase is doing as the pastor of Bent Oak Church, or I'd like to know more about this pastor writer blog, we have all that information on the website, so I might encourage you to maybe check it out while we go to a break. And when we come back, we've moved from sarcasm, next one, adventure, and then ambition, reputation, and apathy. 5 masculine instincts, published by Moody. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we have information on our website. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today, talking about the 5 masculine instincts. Chase Replogle with us, and we are going to be moving our way through the other 4. Just a minute ago, of course, we talked about sarcasm. But Chase, I thought we might focus now on adventure. You referred to that as cultivating new eyes, and nothing wrong with adventure. But I think adventure requires that we actually have some level of discernment. And if there's a word we've been using around point of view quite often this year, it is the need for us to have discernment. So talk about that, because you tie this idea of adventure to the story of Samson.
Well, there seems to be this cultural narrative right now. I know a lot of people are talking about Disney. I think it's in a lot of the Disney movies that have been produced over the last few years. This idea that to know who you are, your true identity, your purpose, your meaning, you need to leave behind tradition and family and place and set on a kind of personal quest to discover yourself, your true self. That idea is pretty pervasive in a lot of the stories that are a part of our culture right now. And it's not hard to see that motive going on in the story of Samson. Samson, you'll remember, didn't choose his Nazirite vows. He was born into those. And he also finds himself an Israelite in a time where Israel was not at a high point of its civilization. They had just entered the Promised Land, this period of the Judges. They were constantly being raided by their neighbors. There was no standing army, no centralized government. And so it is that Samson grows up a young boy looking down on those cities of Philistia down below, the great metropolitan cities, and finding himself increasingly infatuated with everything Philistine. And so story after story, Samson goes down to the Philistines. And it is this quest, not just romantic affection, but a kind of romantic view on life. I'll find myself in adventure and risk and danger and romance. What's surprising about Samson's story is he does not become wiser. He does not become more skilled or enlightened through those quests. He actually seems to be duller and less aware of what God is doing in his life. In the end, of course, giving away his secret to Delilah. What I try to say to a lot of particularly young men who are experiencing a kind of restlessness, maybe you're in your early 30s and now you find yourself with a couple kids and a car payment and a mortgage and a cubicle that maybe is not your dream job. It's easy to start feeling discontent and restless. And where was that great adventure of my life? But no real adventure story in the middle feels adventurous. They all feel hard. They all feel challenging. They feel like something you want to give up. That's true of all the great adventure stories. And so what we really need is we need a kind of discernment that allows us to sense what God is doing in the middle of that story, how God might have us in a narrative that does provide meaning and identity and purpose. But our challenge is we haven't cultivated our eyes, our discernment for recognizing how it is God's working at this place that maybe we consider banal or boring or uninteresting.
And one of the things I appreciate about this chapter, and it's something I hadn't really thought about, how we could use his story for us today, because we are surrounded, Chase, as you well know, by just all sorts of fascinating technology. We also are being seduced every day, if we are not paying attention to biblical principles, to the idea that the better culture is the secular progressive culture. It's the one where you're going to get accolades. It's the one where you're not going to be criticized. It's one where you're not going to be marginalized. So just as you have Samson looking longingly at the Philistine culture, you have a lot of people today looking longingly at this kind of secular progressive culture around us. And when we see so many young people that go off to college and decide to give up on their faith, prominent authors and musicians say they're deconstructing their faith, this probably is a very important chapter in the book. And certainly you've helped me understand that we can use Samson as a great illustration of that.
Yeah, you could certainly describe what Samson goes through as a kind of deconstruction. He doesn't just wholeheartedly abandon his Nazirite commitment. By little by little, the sort of way it plays out is he constantly trivializes it. So he has this remarkable first experience of his strength by the Spirit rushing upon him. He tears apart this lion. He goes back and finds this, what I think is actually a kind of symbol of who he will be. There's bees within the carcass of that lion. Just as he would provide a place for Israel, the congregation of Israel, within the ruin of the Philistines. But what does he do with that experience? Well, he turns it into a drunken riddle, a pun that he gambles on at a feast. And so that really is little by little, he trivializes, and less those vows he had made are central until ultimately, when he gives up his secret to Delilah, he says, if anyone cuts my hair, then I will be like any other man. There's almost a kind of longing in the words that he uses to just be like every other man. That is what he's been after from the beginning, just to be like these Philistines. So yeah, calling it a kind of deconstruction, imagining that on the other side is some better you, some bigger identity, some greater purpose, is a lot of what Samson is wrestling with through his story.
I do love that section there. You have wasted on a drunken pun, but let's move on because we've talked about a couple, sarcasm, adventure. How about ambition? And that is a promised land lost. And this is, of course, the story of Moses, probably one of the more familiar ones, but even here we can discern some very important principles to look at in some cases, again, how these masculine instincts need to be under some level of spiritual control.
Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with ambition. It's a good thing. But ambition does have a tendency to outpace God. It has a tendency to get a vision for something we want to see accomplished, and then to begin to judge the people around us, to judge ourselves and our own abilities, and ultimately to judge God on how well that vision we have, that ambition we have, is playing out. Moses wrestles with this, at times getting it right, at times getting it wrong, wrestling with failure and success. But I'm really struck by that act, what seems to us like a small act of disobedience towards the end when he strikes a rock instead of speaking to it as he was commanded. But yet if you read that passage closely, there's more going on. Moses calls the people together and says, "You rebels, must we produce water from this rock?" God did not give him that language. That was Moses' language. And he begins to mistake his own personal frustration for God's. He begins to mistake his actions for God's, this we pronoun. And ultimately, it's for that reason that he's not allowed to enter the promised land, that he's asked to set down that great ambition of his life. That ambition had sort of overwhelmed him. It swallowed him, absorbed him, and he had lost a proper perspective of who he was, who the people he was leading were, and ultimately who God was. And in the end, God took it from him so that he could regain that proper perspective.
So again, just great material into that. Again, you talk about the need for a check on ambition because, again, we don't want to say that ambition is wrong, but you also talk about sometimes ambition can be disbelief. So just before we take a break and get into some other topics, how should we address that? Because after all, we do see in the New Testament, Paul writing to the church in Thessalonica that you should make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. So obviously, there's a balance between ambition that is godly and ambition that gets us in trouble.
I think what God asks Moses to do is rest. It's a kind of Sabbath, to set down this work. Moses will die on Mount Nebo looking at the promised land that he won't actually enter. We tend to think that Sabbath is something like, if I take one day off, I can get more done on the other 6, like a life hack. But I really think you should think of Sabbath as an intentional check on what you can accomplish, that I may only accomplish 6/7 of what I'm capable of achieving in my life, and that's okay. It's better to do less than I'm feasibly capable of doing so that I don't outpace God or miss what it is God is asking me to do. An intentional kind of check on my ambition to make sure that if God asks at any moment, I'm willing to set that ambition down in obedience to him. That helps us keep that good thing in its proper place without it becoming an ultimate thing.
And again, you use the example of Eric Liddell because, again, an individual that decided he was not going to run on the Sabbath. I don't know that we always have to be maybe as legalistic about that, but that was something that he was really trying to address in terms of honoring the Lord. And, of course, there are some great stories that come from that as well. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll finish off at least 2 more of these masculine instincts. We've talked about sarcasm and adventure and ambition, but when we come back, we'll spend just a little bit of time on 2 that are probably more familiar to you. Reputation. What about David? Really, how to address that issue of his integrity and his reputation. Some very important principles that we see in Proverbs and in the Psalms about that as well, not to mention just, of course, in 1st and 2nd Kings. And then the whole issue of Abraham's greatest test of faith, but the whole issue of having to choose between apathy or obedience. When we talk about apathy, again, as we even talked about yesterday, this idea of maybe what some people are now starting to refer to as toxic passivity, pretty interesting material. And all of this is part of the book, The 5 Masculine Instincts, which, of course, also focus on those instincts, but even has a final chapter that talks about the work ahead, as well as some great material that I think you could use very easily, not only in your own personal study, but for those of of you that have a small group or maybe have a men's group and you would want to work your way through this, I think you're going to find this book very, very helpful. Published by Moody Press. It just came out this month, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have all sorts of links on our website, pointofview.net, so that you can order it there as well. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the 5 masculine instincts. Chase Replogle again with us, and we're talking about a couple of issues. We've talked about sarcasm, adventure, ambition. The other one is reputation, but also this issue of integrity. And of course, you use the story of David, which is in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Of course, you run into it in 1st and 2nd Kings and other places. But this is an intriguing idea because, of course, as we all know, David was all over the map. A man after God's own heart, an individual who was bold and courageous, who was flawed, who was just emotionally in all sorts of different areas. But you use this to help us understand that thinking about our reputation and, more importantly, our integrity are very key. And that's another one of those very important masculine instincts, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mentioned at the beginning, I take these 5 instincts from Shakespeare's Stages of a Man. And at this stage, Shakespeare, I love the description. He says, the man begins to cut his beard, as is expected and dress as is expected. And he also adds, and he begins to put on a little weight. So it's that point in life where a man has been successful, maybe he's achieved something in business or finance, or maybe even just a hobby that you've gotten really good at. And all of a sudden you start caring about that reputation, and particularly about protecting that reputation. This is really the struggle of David's life. It's actually the thing that I think undoes Saul as well, too, is Saul is elevated quickly into this position as king, and he never develops the character or the integrity to sustain that public reputation or image.
Yes.
David wrestles with that, and at times he gets it right. He takes off Saul's armor and fights Goliath as who he actually is, a shepherd with God on his side. But at other times he gets it painfully wrong. He, of course, commits a sin with Bathsheba, but then murders and lies and plots to cover up that sin, to protect his image. One of the things that I do with each of these is try to pair them with a intentional practice. When it comes to integrity, integrity is a word we hear a lot. It gets thrown around by politicians and leaders. We tend to think it means something like, I always do what's right, or, you can count on me even when you're not paying attention. I think integrity is more, I'm willing to bear responsibility and to own both the good and the bad in my life. Mm-hmm. We get this word integrity from integer, a whole number.
Right.
That I take an inventory of my life and take responsibility for the whole thing, even the parts that I do get wrong. And in the end, though David does often get so much wrong, and the consequences are devastating in his family history, it always surprises me that we know so much about David. Mm-hmm. He had the power and the means to erase the records, to burn the records. We live in a day where politicians will spend millions of dollars to cover up their sins and clean up their public reputation. But yet, not only do we get the official records of David's life, but he leaves us in his own words, his cries of repentance, his confessions, that in the end, he lives the kind of confession by laying his whole life, the good and the bad, out there for us. It really is a remarkable act of confession in and of itself.
Again, integrity and integer, no fractions, no decimals, no extra parts, just well said. And just in the interest of time, let's also move on to the last one, apathy, a world too wide. And this, of course, is the story of Abraham. First, Abram, called in Genesis 12, but taking us all the way to Genesis 23. And again, this is a story that is very familiar, but you use that to help us once again understand that even in the midst of this, we need to look at issues like apathy as well as obedience.
Yeah, that phrase, a world too wide, comes from Shakespeare, and you'll be familiar with the scientific idea of entropy, that things over time don't organize themselves, they fall apart. Anything you build begins immediately to fall apart, from the smallest parts of our body to the universe itself. Things are becoming more chaotic and disordered, not ordered. And I think as we age, we feel that more and more. We begin to realize just how complex relationships actually are. We begin to realize how little control we actually have over things in life. And there is a tendency, particularly for us as men, to begin retreating from those things, for an apathy to set in that sends us back to what we can control, the comfort of our recliners and our hobbies, and we have less friends and less complexity. Abraham is, of course, the great example of faith. He moves onto horizons by God's calling, not knowing where he'll actually end up. But when things do go wrong for Abraham, it's often because he can't fully engage the complexity of the moment. When Sarah, his wife, comes up with a plan to produce an heir through Hagar, their servant, that should have been something he opposed, but he goes along with it. But then maybe even worse, when it creates conflict within his home, he says to Sarah, you deal with it. He basically just checks out from the responsibility of what he's created. And of course, Sarah begins to mistreat Hagar. Hagar and Ishmael flee into the wilderness. That actually plays out a few times in Abraham's life, where he just doesn't quite rise to the complexity of the moment. And there's a kind of false ending in Abraham's story, where finally Isaac is born. He signs peace treaties. It says he plants a tamarisk tree in Beersheba. It's almost like a sign of retirement, planting his roots. And you expect it to be Isaac's story when you turn the page. But of course, you turn the page to Genesis 22 and you read, but God tested Abraham. He calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. I have this idea that the greatest moment of risk and vulnerability in Abraham's life was that moment when he had everything, where his faith may have still been in the existence of God, but there wasn't really a need for an actively engaged faith because everything he had waited for had been fulfilled, that God actually puts him back in a position of needing faith to survive, living out that faith to rescue him from that risk of apathy.
And again, we sometimes talk about the danger of midlife and later on and finishing well and all of that. So just great material in this book. It is published by Moody. You can certainly find it in your local bookstore, but also we have a way in which you can order it. But I thought for just a few minutes, Chase, since you are in the process of working on the sacred art of writing at Western Theological Seminary, we have a link to pastorwriter.com. You are obviously a very good writer and very well read, and I think in some respects we can benefit from the material that you have actually posted at pastorwriter.com. And so let's, if we can, encourage people to go there. We have a link on our website, but when people land, what will they find in terms of the podcast and the blog and some of the other writing, and especially who could benefit from going to this website?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. The podcast itself is just my interview with authors around books that I've loved, books that have been helpful for me. So I'm always trying to keep up with what's being published. So if you're looking for book recommendations, it's a great podcast to follow just because I'm talking to a lot of authors who are writing books that I find interesting. But I do some blogging on there as well, too. I share some of my thoughts on cultural moments, important moments. And then, of course, there's a link there that takes you to the website for the book as well, for the 5 Masculine Instincts. And, I hope the conversations are helpful. Hope maybe they help you pick up new books, particularly men. I'm trying to push back a little bit on this idea that men don't read books. There's an audiobook version of my book, so that's helpful as well, too. But a big part of it's just helping expose some of the great books, the great resources we have access to. And I'm so thankful. Even some of the endorsers you've mentioned, I've had the opportunity to have them on the podcast. And there's so many people writing so many great books, and I just try to give a little attention to them where I can.
Let me again just mention that we have a link to the 5 Masculine Instincts. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. And of course, he just mentioned also audiobook, and you just follow those links and that will help you out. And again, just one more time, I would encourage those of you that would like to be better writers. And each year we, of course, encourage you to go to the Christian Writers Conference we do here in the Dallas area, actually done by a different ministry, but we always feature it. Or for those of you that are communicators, whether you're a pastor, a Sunday school teacher, a small group leader, I think you can benefit quite a bit from some of the things Chase has put together at pastorwriter.com. You don't have to remember all that because it's all on our website at pointofview.net. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to hear this again, you can go to the website and click on that red button that says listen, or of course watch. And of course, it'll also be showing up fairly soon at the YouTube channel. So all of the resources are there for you. So Chase, thank you for joining us here on Point of View, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just a word of encouragement to all those men listening. Let's keep growing like Christ, keep developing better Christ-like character. And I do think there's a road forward for us. I'm excited to be on it with you.
Let's take a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit with our good friend, Dr. Frank Turek, and we'll be talking about this national conference on Christian apologetics. Now, the conference usually is in North Carolina. This year it's in South Carolina, and we'll talk about who's there and why you may want to attend or watch online. About that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. They're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about apologetics, and in particular, Apologetics Conference that you may want to attend. We always try to feature those because these are opportunities for you to attend a conference, meet some of the speakers that we've interviewed on this program, or if it's available in some cases to watch it online. Then we're going to get back into the news, and if you look at our printout today, you will see that I've posted lots of arguments and questions and articles about the Disney Corporation, betrayed by the Magic Kingdom. Disney is coming for America, Disney queers, children, and much, much more. We'll get into that a little bit later, although my guest has also posted on that on Twitter, so I'm sure he'll have some thoughts about it. And my guest is Dr. Frank Turek, individual that's been on the program with us many times before, a speaker and award-winning author. We've had him on talking about his books, for example, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Of course, one probably the most famous, one that he co-authored, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, even all the way back to legislating morality, and he's the president of crossexamine.org. We have that website on our website as well, so you can find that link. You might have watched him on television because he has the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist TV program. And of course, he has his radio program, Cross Examined, and perhaps you've also seen his columns that appear in such places as townhall.com. Dr. Frank Turek, it is always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, great being with you. How are things?
We are well, and you travel quite a bit and speak on college campuses. As you know, I used to do more of that, but radio kind of keeps me there. It's like a dairy farm. You have to milk the cows every day, so I don't get out there like you do. But I have had a chance to watch you and also see some things on various YouTube channels, and it seems to me that you still have a really ongoing and dynamic ministry speaking on all these campuses.
Well, we go to campuses, Kerby, because it's probably the least Christian place in the United States of America. And what we do when we go to these campuses is we present, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, to present for like an hour and 45 minutes and then take anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half worth of questions at these events. And if people go to crossexamine.org, that's crossexamine with a D on the end of it.org, they can see these events because they're on our YouTube channel. We stream them all. And there's a lot of questions that come up at the end. And so what we're trying to do is throw a lifeline to Christians and put a stone in the shoe of the skeptics to try and get them to at least consider the Christian worldview, because, as you know, it's pretty much mocked on the college campus, when in fact the most intellectual position to take is the idea that there's an ultimate cause out there who is self-existing, who created all things and sustains all things, and who actually came to earth, added humanity to his deity to pay for the sins that we've all committed.
I might just mention again, we do have a link on our website, crossexamined, as you said, with a D.org, but you don't have to remember all that because we have a link. And you have, for example, your latest podcast, an interview you did with Dr. Michael Brown on silencing of the lambs and much more. But let's, if we can, make sure that we focus some time and attention on the National Conference on Christian Apologetics. I've been to that in the past, speaking back when it was in Charlotte, North Carolina. This time, though, it is, interestingly enough, at First Baptist Church Rock Hill in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And so for our listeners both in North Carolina and South Carolina, this is something I would encourage you to go to, and it's April 8th and 9th. But give us a little bit more understanding of what is happening at the conference, what's the theme, and then we'll talk about some of the things you're going to be talking about.
Yeah, Kirby, it's actually only about a half hour south of Charlotte, so if people want to come in from out of town, you just still go to the Charlotte airport and just drive south about 30 minutes. You'll be there. The theme is really being steadfast in an upside-down world, and as you well know, you cover this every day, the world is getting crazier by the moment. In fact, it's getting so absurd, Kirby, that the people at the Babylon Bee, the Christian satire site, when they put a headline out, a lot of people think it's true.
Who would have guessed?
Did this really happen? I mean, I post those on my Twitter account, and sometimes people will say, "Hey, do you know this is satire?" Yeah, I know it's satire. It's getting so absurd. It's hard to make absurd headlines anymore.
Yes. Well, again, I've posted some, and I've stopped doing it because people would say that kind of thing. You know, are you an idiot? Do you not know this is not true? I said, no. Okay, all right. I guess
it is true.
Yeah,
it is true. But
some of them come out and they become true, and that's important too because there is really a need right now in an upside down world. And this is why I'm such a supporter of whether it's ministries like Christian Apologetics Conferences, whether it's Summit Ministries, whether it's Probe's Mind Games Conference, whatever it might be, because young people growing up actually in this upside down world oftentimes don't know that there's an alternative, and they think that there must be more than two genders because we can't necessarily have this idea of binary sex, and then there are all sorts of ideas that are upside down, and men can be women, and on and on and on. And so there's just sometimes the need to just speak some clarity into the culture. And so that brings me to one of the things you're going to be talking about. Should you follow your heart? I saw a piece the other day, since we'll be talking about Disney, that, you know, originally some of the Disney stories would be, well, follow your heart. And back, again, since I'm the old guy around the table, decades ago, if you were following your heart, you'd be following maybe what would be sort of the Christian ideas in the culture. But now, if you follow your heart and you recognize the heart is deceitful and you recognize that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, I'm sort of giving your talk, but I suspect that's what you're going to be addressing that hour, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, certainly. And with regard to transgenderism, since you brought it up, you know that transgenderism presupposes fixed genders? I mean, because if I'm a man, but I think I'm a woman, yes, I have to have some idea of what a man is and some idea of what a woman is to know the difference. I also have to have some idea of what a man is and some idea of what a woman is in order to try and make the so-called transition. So transgenderism presupposes fixed genders on one hand, yet on the other hand, they try and say there are no fixed genders. Well, you know, the people in the LGBTQ community, Kirby, are starting to realize there's a bit of a civil war going on, because if the T's get their way, the transgenders, they've just defined the L, the G, and the B out of existence. Because if there are no fixed genders, how can you be lesbian, gay, or bisexual? You can't.
And yet you have this kind of non-binary idea, but then when you get over into the issue of race, well, everything there is binary, because either you're an oppressor or you're a victim. So
yeah, that's right.
And again, this is the reason I want you to go to this conference, because if you sit under the teaching of Frank Turek, Dr. Frank Turek, you're going to learn so many good ideas, and even the idea of putting a rock in their shoes. I know Greg Kokel's used that idea as well. Yep. And I want to come back to another one, because I left the more controversial one to talk about after the break, because you also will be talking about this idea, how can Jesus be the only way? So we're going to get into that in some detail. And I thought maybe I'd ask you a few questions about the whole issue of the Disney Corporation, since, of course, I follow Frank Turek on Twitter and certainly have appreciated all the material that is on his website. By the way, it's a website that you really want to visit, and that's why we have a link to crossexamine.org. And you don't have to remember all that, but you will find out a lot about his podcast, about his broadcast, and all the rest, and such great wisdom. If you find yourself trying to interact with a culture which is sort of turned upside down, we're calling evil good and good evil out of Isaiah 5. We'll learn some principles from him. But let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Frank Turek as we promote the National Conference on Christian Apologetics, April 8th and 9th, right there in Rock Hill, South Carolina. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we come to the end of the first quarter of 2022, I think we can say we've learned a few lessons which we should apply to the future. One lesson comes from Canada. The other lesson comes from Russia. The controversy over the truckers in Canada revealed some economic lessons to us about Western democracies that used to be disregarded as nothing more than conspiracy theories. The response from Justin Trudeau showed that even a liberal democratic government could seize the bank accounts and financial assets of ordinary citizens. Canada is the 9th largest economy in the world and one of the most advanced democracies in the world, yet it used emergency measures to freeze accounts and seize accounts without due process. The Canadian actions are why many investors are looking for censorship-resistant assets. The second lesson came from the economic response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The EU and the U.S. were able to seize Russian central bank assets. U.S. treasuries are supposed to be one of the safest assets in existence. They're supposed to be a zero-risk asset. The assumption was central banks would treat each other with sovereign immunity. Simultaneously, Visa and MasterCard stopped processing foreign purchases of millions of Russian citizens. Apple and Google shut off their smartphone-enabled payments. This unplugging of the world's 11th largest economy is a new chapter in the history of economic conflict. Our world relies on a financial system working efficiently, but these actions are unprecedented. Sanctions have been used before against smaller countries, but this is different. We may agree with these sanctions against Russia, but this illustrates a point I've made before. If these Western governments can shut off a powerful government like Russia, imagine what they can do to you. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Frank Turek, and we're talking about the National Conference on Christian Apologetics. We have a special link on that on our website, as well as, of course, a link to Frank Turek's ministry as well. Might just mention real quickly before I get into some of the other talks you're going to be giving, to mention that Dr. Hugh Ross will be there. J. Warner Wallace, probably the best book that I've enjoyed from him recently, Person of Interest. Matter of fact, we give to some of our top donors some of what we think are the best books, and we're actually selecting his book as one of those. Elisa Childers, who wrote Another Gospel, but also her father, Chuck Girard, for those of us a little bit older, remember some of that. And then a debate that is taking place. Is a good God logically possible? And I want to get to all that in just a minute, but I did set up the fact that, Frank, you're also going to be addressing this issue. How can Jesus be the only way? That is a question that surfaces so often with Generation Y and Generation Z. So I think it's a very important question to address, and give us a little bit of a preview of how you're going to talk about that.
Well, the short answer is that it's not an arbitrary claim that Jesus is the only way. It's based in the very ground of reality, and that is that since God is infinitely just and infinitely loving, he's caught in a bit of a dilemma when it comes to us, because all of us have sinned. All of us are fallen, so all of us deserve justice. But God, since he's loving, doesn't want to give us justice. So what does he do? He has to punish an innocent substitute in our place in order to remain just if he's going to justify us. And Paul explains this in Romans chapter 3, verse 26, where he says that God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. In other words, what he does is he punishes an innocent substitute himself in order to remain just and allow us who are unjust to go unpunished. So Jesus is the only way, because that's the only way you can reconcile infinite justice and infinite love, is to remain just without punishing people who actually deserve it. He punishes a substitute. It turns out to be himself. Now, I go into a lot more detail in the presentation, which we'll do there at the conference, and it's I think it's April 8th and 9th, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Yeah, it starts next Thursday, so a week from today. And if they go to ses.edu, they can find out more about this.
We also have a link course on our website. It's ses.edu/Southern Evangelical Seminary announces, and you don't have to have all that because we have the link there. And so there is a video that you can watch. There's some information about that, and of course, lots of resources. And of course, there's a variety of other things related to the seminary, which of course you've attended. 3 reasons a seminary education may be right for you. So we've got all sorts of great links already there for the website, and I would encourage that. But just before we maybe get into some of the issues in the news, I thought it was very telling that one of the debates that you will have during this conference is a good God logically possible? Now, I've said, and you may agree or disagree, but Frank, I remember a day when it used to be when we were on campus, or when I was even talking to non-Christians, they would wonder whether the Bible is true, whether or not we have evidence for God. There are still people asking that question, but they're not so much asking, is God true, or does God exist, but does a good God exist? Or even more importantly, not so much is the Bible true, but is the Bible good? And so it's been almost a little bit of a change, almost a nuance in terms of this whole idea that, well, yeah, I might believe there's a God, but Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, when he was alive, and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, they're arguing that if there is a God, and we doubt there is, then he's a malevolent, evil individual that we should not worship. So I see this debate as being very instrumental in addressing that issue.
Yeah, the problem is they're presupposing a standard when they say that, and the question is, where does that standard come from? Well, you know where they're getting it from? They're stealing it from God himself, which is the subject of a book I wrote called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. If you're going to say God isn't good, what standard are you judging God in order to say he isn't good? If there is no God, there is no good, actually. In fact, Richard Dawkins admits that. He says if we just live in a world of blind, pitiless forces that didn't have that didn't have us in mind, he said there is no good, there is no bad, there is no justice. He said we just dance to our DNA. And so if God doesn't exist, you can't say anything's good or bad. You can just say, well, you prefer one action to another action. Only if God exists, if there's a standard beyond us, can we say something is good or bad. Now, what you can say is you can say, look, okay, I do believe in God, but I don't think that the Christian God is the true God. Okay, well, that's a fair position to take. You just can't support it, though, because the evidence shows that the Christian God is the true God, because Jesus did rise from the dead. In fact, Gary Habermas, who's probably the top guy in the world on the resurrection right now, he'll be at this conference, too, talking about that. So they're presupposing a standard when they say that, as you know, Kerby. And so I was just asking them, by what standard are you claiming something's good or bad or right or wrong or evil or good? You're assuming God in order to say that.
Well, and I did not realize that Gary's there, because in the sheet I have, his name's not there. So, again, you're worth going to here, J. Warner Wallace, Elisa, all sorts of individuals are worth, but when you put them all together, it's just an embarrassment of riches. And I love the way you make the argument. Sometimes people say, well, I just have trouble believing in a resurrection. But your argument is, if you believe that God created the universe, then anything else, any other kind of miracle is kind of second level, actually. So, again, you bring them back to some of these first principles. And so there are people that can really learn from the material that you've put together, because they wonder, what do I say to my unbelieving friend, neighbor, coworker, family member in a time, as we've said, which we live where the world is upside down and where individuals are always arguing that really the default value should be atheism, and anybody that believes in God is believing in some kind of spaghetti monster and shouldn't really be taken seriously. And so you give us some really good information and ammunition so that we can be more effective in witnessing to our friends and neighbors.
Well, the key question I want people to ask is this, Kerby, and I ask this of atheists on college campuses all the time. The question is, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists stand in front of the microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no. I say, no? How's that reasonable? How's that rational? It's not. The problem isn't in the head. The problem's in the heart. They don't want Christianity to be true. They don't want God to exist. Why? Because they want to be God of their own lives. You see, they're not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. Here's the problem. You can make yourself happy temporarily doing a lot of fun things, but over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone who's listening to me who's over 40 knows what I'm talking about, because many of us have tried it ourselves. The only way to get true and eternal contentment is to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. So always ask people, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? If they hesitate or say no, it's not a head problem, it's a heart problem. In fact, most people are looking for God like a criminal's looking for a cop. They're not interested.
Such great lines. Let me just mention that we do have a link to your website, and I'm going to have to let you go in just a minute, but for example, on the website we have the information. We have your Twitter post in which you posted one of the articles we have here about Disney queers children. You might not like the phrase, but that's actually the way the executive with the Disney Corporation spoke to that issue. And so it is, I think, a good illustration of why in this unbelievably upside down world, people need to know more about this conference. And again, we mentioned April 8th and 9th, First Baptist Church, Rock Hill in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Again, for those of you in North Carolina, just head south. Those of you in South Carolina, head a little bit north. And I would encourage you to be there next week. And if you can't, I'm sure there'll be some ways in which there'll be material that you can find later on from all of these very gifted speakers that will be there. So, Frank, as always, appreciate what you're doing in your own ministry, but thank you for speaking biblical truth out there on the college campuses. And thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. God bless.
Let's take a break. Okay, time to get into Disney. And we have given you, I think, probably the largest list here of 4 different articles, probably the ones I've seen people quote most often. And some of you have some thoughts and comments about this. And it has been amazing to me how in a very short period of time, the Disney Corporation has managed to make themselves front and center. And I thought that's kind of intriguing if you think about this, because after all, we've always had some questions about some of the Disney characters. But once they decided to go after this particular piece of legislation that was passed by the Florida legislature and signed by the governor, they've become dead center. They've been kind of at the very center of the culture wars. And I love what some people are saying, that there is probably more damage that has been done to the Disney brand than probably any other brand you can think of in recent memory, other than maybe New Coke. I thought that was a pretty good line, and it illustrates, again, why some people are starting to say, you know what, probably not going to get the Disney Channel. Not so sure I'm going to go see Mickey Mouse anytime in the future. So we'll take a break and talk about what you would think about that, and we'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half-century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Story@pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, going to focus our time on the Disney Corporation, and I will certainly acknowledge that there are other issues in the news, and we will cover a lot of those tomorrow. Certainly what's going on in Ukraine, some of the various proposals being put forth right now by the Biden administration are important, so we will get to some of those. But I thought, give us about a half an hour here to really talk about something that has been sort of remarkable, because a lot of this really surfaced surfaced because of the bill that made its way through the Florida legislature. The actual bill's title is Parental Rights in Education. Now, if you'd never heard that name, it's because the LGBTQ critics have always called it the Don't Say Gay bill. And it is amazing to me, if you go out on Twitter, don't recommend it, the number of people that are actually, even in this late hour, convinced that the bill says that you can't say gay, and it doesn't even have the word in the bill, and it's nothing of the sort. It actually just prohibits classroom instruction on the issue of sexual orientation and gender for early grades, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. That's all. That's really all it is. And there's a kind of the argument, well, a first grade lesbian teacher should be able to present her sexual involvement with her partner. My answer would be, no, she doesn't have that right. And I've shared this before. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area with a homosexual uncle, but in the first grade or in kindergarten, wherever you want to use it, I didn't need to know all the details of my homosexual uncle and his partner and all the other exploits that they were involved with. And we believe in the innocence of a child. And the reason that this actually has come unglued, I think, gets to one of the articles we've posted. And it actually is a piece by Peter Rex. And he put it this way. There's a hostage situation in Disney right now. The kidnappers, a mob of woke employees, the victim, the company's CEO, because he actually at the time said that he didn't want to take a stand on these issues because oftentimes any corporate statement are weaponized by one side or the other to further divide and inflame. Well, that didn't work so very well. So the woke mob took him hostage, and the various Disney executives attacked their employer on social media. Employees staged a nationwide walkout. So rather than stand his ground, of course, the CEO decided to actually capitulate. And now he's been, of course, as the article by Peter Rex points out, doing the woke mob's bidding. And as a result, has been apologizing, donated $5 million of the company's money to activist groups, and then talked about wanting to get meaningful action against the bill, which, of course, no longer is just a bill, but a bill that has become law. So in less than a month, you've had Disney gone from not taking a side to waging a culture war, and now they're actually fighting similar kinds of legislation that will be probably considered here in the state of Texas. Also, actions already taken by the Attorney General. Now, again, the piece that I've read from at the moment here is companies aren't responding to the demands of their employees, or even most of their employees. They're just giving in to the loudest voices. This is a documentation I wanted you to have, because here he points out at Disney, employees are passing around right now a petition asking the company to stay neutral in this fight in Florida. They want their employer to focus on what they're supposed to be doing, not what they're doing. But because, of course, all of the attention that Disney now has placed on this issue, Disney has become front and center. Now, again, I appreciate the fact that this article, it's actually a second article of our Peter Rex, is, look, he says every business leader and employee is entitled to their own opinions and should have the freedom to share them publicly. And he says, I do that myself sometimes. But it, he thinks, crosses a line to speak on behalf of all the employees, throwing a company's full weight behind a political cause with no connection to its corporate mission. And if anything, you can see where this is going to lead, because there are more and more people that are simply saying, you know, I haven't been pleased with the way the Disney Corporation has been moving for some time. I think Walt Disney, if he were still alive, would be horrified by some of the things that have been done, but there we are. And so in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about our good friends at American Family Association have called for maybe a boycott of one of these movies. But I also want to get your thoughts. There have been interviews that have been done. Some people say, well, that's it. I'm no longer going to renew my annual pass for Disneyland or Disney World, or I'm not going to no longer get the Disney Channel. I've had others say, well, we have people coming from all over the world So we need to be as gay-friendly as we can and even transgender-friendly as we can. So we'll see where that takes us, but I'd love to get some of your thoughts. But let me head out to California first. Adam, you'll start us off here. What's your thoughts about what is happening there at the Disney Corporation?
I just wanted to say I thank you guys for being on these topics, especially from a Christian perspective. And I just have seen it evolve. I've been a big fan of Disney since I was young, and I'm in my mid-40s. And I've seen it slowly evolve. It's one thing to be fantasy about being an animal or, being, something unhuman, but to do something like that with kids, and now you see it even more, like Beauty and the Beast, they'll have somebody that you don't know, but you know by their actions and their, character that they're bringing out, that they're neutral. And they've been doing it more and more. And even in secular movies, you can't watch a movie without having something like that represent itself. So I'm just seeing it evolve more and more in our culture, our movies, and especially children's, shows and movies.
I also noticed that you had said to our screener that you had first seen some of the gay celebrations at the theme parks. And since you're in California, probably you're thinking Disneyland. And I've been both to Disneyland and Disney World, but it's been a long time since I've been there. But we, over time, even sometimes wanted to alert our listeners when there would be some kind of gay pride event at the park, just so if you did not want to have your kids there at the time and have to explain some of the I'll use a nice word, shenanigans that took place in the street, you didn't have to explain some of that. So that's another example of that as well, isn't it?
Yes, and Magic Mountain is another big popular place out here, too, because we've had that with the biggest and most scariest roller coasters, and they fell along with that in Knoxbury Farm. And you're right. I don't want to impose that because it's pushing the issue. The kids are going to find out the world has what it has already. But we need to push it in family environments to where they don't have a choice to go and not be participant or surrounded by it.
Yep. And again, this is one of the things we've talked about before. It's really kind of borrowing some from this book, Woke Inc., and maybe we'll get the author on because this has a good illustration. There's a couple other authors that have written about this recently that point out that the argument is always, we just want equality. In other words, we, for example, let's take same-sex marriage. We just want to be able to get married. We don't have an agenda beyond that. And the moment same-sex marriage becomes legal, and it really only because of a decision made by the Supreme Court, quote, became legal, then the next day, what's the next issue? Well, now we're going to punish anybody that does not do a same-sex marriage, and we will also then promote transgenderism. Every time you think, well, let's just let them have that, and then that will be enough, it is never enough. And, of course, you can never be woke enough. Of course, we've said that before. But I think what Adam was pointing out is very similar to one of the other articles we've posted, and this one is the first article by Larry O'Connor entitled Betrayed by the Magic Kingdom, because he said, I grew up with the wonderful world of Disney every Sunday night at 7 p.m. while the parents and grown-ups were watching 60 Minutes. I'd watch the Disney show. I was totally unsupervised. My parents didn't need to sit in the room with me to ensure the programming was appropriate for a 4 or 5-year-old. My parents trusted Disney, and it goes through this whole long list of course, why you could trust during the so-called family viewing hour. And Disney was supposed to be the last remaining place, virtually and literally, where fundamental norms were reinforced, or at least they would not be infringed upon or completely undermined. He says, well, those days are apparently all over, and as a result, the house that Walt built has crossed a Rubicon, the sort that may tarnish the formidable brand forever, and then goes on to remind us that if you just now watch some of these videos, and we're going to talk about this after the break, because Krista Rufo, who's been with us before, has now posted some of these videos, some of these Zoom calls and other things where they're really being very blunt about what they're going to do. They've now decided that they will no longer at the theme parks begin with ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, because after all, that would be somehow hateful and bigoted to say ladies and gentlemen. Of course, that'd be also some kind kind of binary, boys and girls. And so as a result, they can't even say that now at the theme parks. And I love his last line. If Disney doesn't reverse course and do some serious damage control, this will soon be seen as one of the most disastrous brand disintegrations in American corporate history. The folks who gave you New Cope are chuckling to themselves right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about the Disney Corporation, and let me just help you understand that we have posted 4 specific articles, which I've read from parts of 2 of those. 2 more I'm going to talk about during this segment, so that you have kind of a resource, because you may want to talk to friends, neighbors, coworkers, members of your representative, or a variety of others, maybe get out on Facebook or Twitter and make some comments, and we give you a lot of facts and figures. So this is kind of a kit, if you will, of material. Before we're done, we're also going to talk about what our friends at American Family Association are suggesting as one action item. And if you keep listening to Point of View, we'll probably give you some other action items as well. But let me take another phone calls first. We'll go to Arizona this time. KNLB, Martha, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for taking the call, Kerby. So along the lines of the Disney topic you were discussing, I think they're trying to desensitize people and make the transgender movement more of a societal norm than it really is, and make it more acceptable. And they're starting with the youngest people, and they're stealing their innocence. You know, if they're raised with this, they will think it's normal. And we did it with violence in Hollywood. We did it with cussing in Hollywood. And now they're trying to do it with something that's way too personal. Plus, they're tearing apart the family in this way, you know, making families what you think they can be. So really, that's not what Disney's for. It's kind of like brainwashing.
I think you're right on target. And again, it's not just speculative, because if you go to these other articles I'm going to now read, and I will probably again just summarize them. So I would encourage you to print out all 4 of these if you'd like. Each one of them, I think, illustrates the point. And even back to the legislation that started this, back when there was a vote on this, one of the individuals in the Florida Senate, you have both the Florida House and the Florida Senate, that would be Danny Burgess, said, look, this concept of what we're talking about here in terms of parental rights is not radical. He says the bill says, parents, your right to raise your children does not end when they walk into a classroom. This bill recognizes that parents are not the enemy. The bill simply says that there should be an age limit on certain discussions. It's not a new concept, nor is it radical. Matter of fact, when we had Keisha Russell with us, not only is she just an outstanding lawyer, she also is a former teacher. And she said, if you look at this, the piece of legislation in Florida really is just codified in what already is in the law, if you think about that. But, okay, let's go back to what Martha said just a minute ago. One of the articles, this will be the 4th article, because I'm going to move from that one back to the 3rd article in just a minute. But the 4th article actually has some very interesting videos, and I encourage you to watch them yourself. Don't believe what I have to say. I'm going to give you direct quotes, but you can watch these individuals that are executives in the Disney Corporation. What do they intend? And then you can read them. You can see them. You can even pass them on. You can even post them if you want on a Facebook page or a Twitter feed or something of that nature. But one of those individuals, who's a corporate president, said, I'm here as a mother of 2 queer children. So think about that for just a minute, especially when you're talking about how young some of them are. 1 transgender child and 1 pansexual child, and then goes on to say, I feel a responsibility to speak, not just for myself, but for them. She goes on to say, for example, we had an open forum last week where, again, the home of really incredible, groundbreaking LGBTQIA stories over the years, where one of our execs stood up and said, you know, we only have a handful of queer leads. That's the word they use, queer leads in our content, and that can't be true. And so she added, what we really want to do is to have many, that's her. We have many LGBTQIA characters in our stories, yet we don't have enough leads and narratives in which gay characters are just to get to be characters and not have them be about gay stories. So the implication from, and these are her words, is if you think we have put a lot of gay, lesbian, transgender content in Disney stories so far, you haven't seen anything. More is coming along the way. And that should cause you some concern. But I skipped over the 3rd article, which is by our good friend Rod Dreyer. Remember, he is an individual that has written for everything from the Dallas Morning News. This one appeared in the American Conservative. And again, it's entitled Disney Queers Children, says Disney Executive, because again, he provides us with some of these links in which you have individuals that are actually bragging about the fact that they are introducing more and more homosexual themes, transgender themes into the presentations, so that, again, it will obviously, as Martha was talking about, desensitize many individuals and also cause more and more conversations, and in a sense maybe even create more individuals questioning their own sexual identity. Think about when you were in the 1st grade or 2nd grade. There was a sense in which you might have been not so much homophobic as heterophobic. Remember, boys used to say girls have cooties, and girls would say boys are yuck. And so if you already are sort of not liking the opposite sex, as sometimes happens in kindergarten, 1st grade, and then you see individuals kissing each other and loving each other and having different kind of sexual orientations, you can see how that actually can be a way to possibly recruit individuals. And as I've said before, at the age of 6 or 7, a lot of these kids, I mean, they're just about eating anything, believing just about anything, doing some pretty bizarre things. This is not exactly where they have a fully formed brain, certainly not a fully formed prefrontal cortex. And to assault them with these kinds of images and ideas, I think almost gets to tantamount to child abuse, which is some of the conversation taking place right now, even with the Attorney General in the state of Texas. But some of you might say, okay, what do we do about this? Well, one action item, which comes from American Family Association, is that Christians should boycott Disney's new movie called Lightyear. Now, you might say, why that? Well, first of all, it's the next Disney movie coming out. But here's something very interesting. What you had is that originally the previous cut of the movie removed a section where lesbians were kissing, and now they've reintroduced it into the movie. So again, you are starting to deal with, not only are we not going to back down, we're going to double down. And so this is why there have been a number of individuals that have said, maybe it's time to say no to Disney. Maybe it's time to say no to the CEO of Disney Corporation. And so we have information, of course, that you can find about these various actions. And as we develop a little bit more, maybe there'll be some other action items that we can put together. But if you go to afa.net, you'll certainly see their action item right now. And if you're looking to do something, there's something to do. If you say, well, I'm just not going to go to any Disney theme park, well, that's good, but it'd be better if you said, I'm not going to go, and I'm going to send a letter to Disney, and we will give you some of those addresses probably in the future. Might even do some of that next week during Truth Team, because I think this illustrates why we do what we do, to give you news, information, commentary, perspective, action items to make a difference. So I'm simply out of time today. We may get into this a little bit tomorrow, but there are a lot of other things to talk about. But I thought giving you at least a half an hour to think about the Disney Corporation and to have access to the 4 articles that we've posted here today will give you more than enough information and ammunition to make a difference. So we've equipped you. Now go out and make a difference. First of all, as always, want to thank Doug for his help as an engineer, as well as he's been helping me tape my commentaries this week, and that has been very helpful. Of course, I always appreciate what Steve does as our producer, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to go back and learn a little bit more from Chase or from Frank, we have those pieces of information on our website. The articles are there. So go out there and make it a better world. That's what we are dedicated to every day. To light a lamp and tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.